So we'll start our review of physical development during early childhood. But before we do, let's just do a quick study hint for any class. Teachers can only put so much things on a PowerPoint. They're designed to guide you. You need to take additional notes. I've never, as a student, taken a class in which the teacher put, in those days, on the board all you needed. You had to take additional notes. Same thing with PowerPoints. So I'm always amazed at class when students only take down what's on the PowerPoint. The teacher will be talking for minutes and minutes teaching, and students don't take notes. So don't be one of those students. If you are, switch to the other side. So you probably intuitively know that babies have a very different proportion than adults, but maybe not the degree so. Look at the picture below. The newborn's head is roughly a third of the entire body length. Imagine beings walking around with the proportions of the newborn. They would look rather maybe alien-esque, to say the least. So with each passing year, the child takes on a more and more adult shape, which means the head proportion is becoming less and less. During early childhood, overall, the child will gain 3 inches every year and 4 to 5 pounds. So imagine, since this is 2 to 6, imagine in 4 years that you would be a foot taller than you are now. So it's amazing growth. At the end of the stage at age 6, the child will be about 46 pounds and about 46 inches. Very convenient for memory. And minimal difference between boys and girls. So we can't say that, the boys will be more. Not at this age. And the vast majority of them will be, of course, right-handed at about 90%. The rest, lefties or ambidextrous people. So let's continue and look at the brain. At age 5, 95% of the adult weight. I think that's amazing. 6, 95, and if you want to guess what 7 would be, 100, yes, you'd be right. So again, the head and brain much more developed, reflecting the top-down pattern. Take a moment. Do you remember the fancy name for the top-down pattern? Hopefully you're thinking cephalocaudal, head to tail. During this time period, myelinization continues. That's that fatty insulation of the neuron. So the neurons are getting more efficient, quicker. New synapses occur, and learning comes down to dendrites and the spaces between dendrites. And forming new synapses is one way in which those new information are imprinted on our brain. So a computer might get a change in its hard drive. You do too, but your hard drive is composed of neurons and synapses. Synaptic pruning will occur. So if you look at the picture, a 6-year-old actually has more neurons than a 14-year-old. So neurons that are not used, some of them are not retained, and synapses which are not used will not be retained. So the pruning helps to be efficient, eliminate unneeded excess. So brain and synapse loss is actually normal and good and healthy. So let's consider other brain changes. Changes in the cortex, specifically the frontal cortex, and if we want to get highly specific, the prefrontal cortex. Those changes result in increasingly complex thinking, which we'll consider later on in this chapter, and greater emotional control. So frustration at this age, as the child proceeds through early childhood, will be less likely to reflect screaming, yelling, and so on, crying. So greater emotional control. The corpus callosum undergoes a growth spurt, becoming much more efficient. Do you remember from intro psych? It's those bands of fibers, technically those bands of axons, the neuron's axons, that connect each side of the each side of the brain. So the brain's communication between the left and right side is becoming increasingly more efficient. The right hemisphere develops, and you might remember the right hemisphere is for spatial things, distance, geometry, shape, and in no small part, we'll see improved writing and drawing skills reflecting this improvement. The left hemisphere that you might remember from intro psych is specialized for language, both productive and receptive, speaking and understanding. So you'll see a great enhancement of the child's verbal ability also during this age, reflecting by the underpinning of brain changes. Is motor development primarily muscle or brain? The answer would be brain. It reflects maturation in various brain centers, including hand movement, including spatial organization, including the cerebellum. So absolutely brain. We've already considered gross and fine motor skills. So consider the following examples and please identify them. And in general, girls are better at tasks with fine motor skills. So walking, definitely a gross motor skill. Dressing, think of the manipulation of the zippers, the buttons, and so on. Tying the shoelaces would be primarily fine motor skills. Jumping, of course, gross. Eating, if you break your hand, try to work with your other hand. See how difficult it is. Or writing, for example, with the other hand. So definitely both fine motor skills. Pencil use, definitely fine motor skill. Probably very easy, and that's fine. So let's consider the development of fine motor skills in terms of pencil use. So toddler eye on the left, scribbling, no discernible forms. By age 3 or 4, though, drawing clearly recognizable pictures like the one on the right. Early printing, probably going to start working out between 4 and 6 years. I should mention that many of your elders are surprised that many schools are no longer teaching cursive writing, and that's problematic, especially if you're going to be a historian, in which you're going to have to read original sources. But just letters from people, it's just a skill that hopefully will not die out. But maybe I'm just reflecting my age. Though to use the terminology we learned in this course, not really age as much as cohort. Before COVID, relatively few parents would have declined immunization against basic childhood diseases. In part, they're required for school attendance and lack of immunizations unless it's excused by medical or religious exemptions, which would vary from state to state. The child would not be given access to public education, so might have to be homeschooled, for example. Due to immunizations being standard in our country, sometimes they call it herd vaccination, but anyway, has led to a dramatic decrease in child diseases. You probably remember the picture I showed you of all the children that were afflicted by polio. And I actually did meet one when I was a child, and my mother was very unhappy with her parent for not choosing to immunize and leaving a child that was permanently in crutches. Why don't parents immunize? Quite a few misconceptions. Oh, the picture there is a very famous anti-vaxxer, Charlie Sheen. When he divorced and his wife took his children for immunization, in protest he paid the doctor in pennies. So in part, the choice relates to who you take your information from, anti-vaxxers or organizations like the CDC and the WHO, or your family physician. Parents think it's unnecessary because those diseases have been eradicated. Well, they are starting to come back. Causes autism is one of the most common fears. There were 2 positive studies which were both retracted by the journal. Modern studies suggest possibly a higher rate of autism related to sometimes severe brain injury which can occur during some of these diseases. The 2 studies were both performed by Wakefield. The first one in 1998, based on a whopping 12 children developed autism within 1 month of having their MMR shot. And you say, aha, proof. No. Well, children develop autism at different ages, so one should compare the children that are immunized to the children that are not immunized but are like in every other way. We've had huge studies, including multi-million children, in which there was found no link, or some studies actually find a slightly higher link, sometimes statistically significant, sometimes not, in an increase in autism in unimmunized children. I thought I'd add a little bit more information onto the Wakefield study. The original Wakefield study with the 12 children had no control group. Other researchers, British, at the same time period, looked at over 50,000. Over 50,000 children that were immunized between ages 1 and 2, the standard age, and it would be expected that 25 children in the group would get autism just based on the prevalence of autism at that point in time, so that Wakefield was able to find 12 children in England that were 1 to 2 years old and they got autism after a shot. Actually not impressive whatsoever. There have been many large subsequent studies. I accidentally almost want to say 500,000, because there was a study done in Denmark with over 500,000 children comparing immunized and unimmunized. No difference. Another Danish study, slightly bigger, 650,000 and change children. Again, no connection. And some parents say, well, it's not the polio per se, it's the medium that the shot is in. And a study done in Quebec, fairly large size, almost 30,000, found no relationship with the underlying ingredient that the polio vaccine is used in. So you can find study after study with good methodology finding no link. These 2 studies, which were retracted by their journals, did find a link. So I personally consider this link in people's mind about the same as that there is no global warming. Studies, if you don't want to look at the research and you just have made up your mind based on your favorite news show or your favorite politician, yeah, you can say any claim, but the supporting information that, that there's a relationship between vaccine and immunization, or for that matter, that there is no such thing as global warming that's caused by humans, just totally defies the research. So I hope you would be an evidence-based thinker and not my favorite news show is Fox, or my favorite ex-president is so-and-so sort of person. If before this section of the course you thought that there was a strong body of evidence by science to suggest that autism was being caused by childhood vaccinations, and you're still kind of a little bit on the fence, here's just another bit of information. You can read the quote from Autism Speaks, but you might ask, well, how does that relate to other experts? Well, if you compare their statement to maybe the WHO, which I assume you know is World Health Organization, or AAP, which I'm pretty sure you know is American Academy of Pediatrics, they both are in agreement with the statement and echo it. So if you're on the fence, don't be. The scientific evidence is ever so clear. Previously, I mentioned 2 studies done by Norway that both found no relationship between childhood immunizations and autism, but perhaps more impressive evidence is a meta-analysis. I don't know if you know what a meta-analysis is, but it takes multiple studies and combines all the data. So if you really don't care about reading the methodology of individual studies and you just want the big picture, as a student, I always loved the meta-analysis. In this particular one, it involved 1,250,000 children, and it's actually more than that. I just rounded down for a nice, neat number. So anyway, 1,250,000 children. Again, no association between vaccines and the children being on the spectrum later on. Nutrition is perhaps no more important than any age in early childhood, except for perhaps infancy and toddlerhood. Poor quality diets have been associated with a decrease in height, as well as increase of cognitive and behavioral issues once the child gets to uh, pre-K or K or the older elementary schools years. But the problem is many American children are living food insecure, and many live in what's called a food desert. Now, the concept of food desert will be explained on the next slide. But if you say, hey, I don't have enough food either, remember that as a student at our college, you can visit, while you're enrolled, the food pantry 3 times in a 1-month period. It has to be in different weeks, I will say that. And you'll be given over $200 worth of food product, and also a list of other very local resources if that's not sufficient. So if you need it, definitely use those resources. But let's go to the next slide and consider what a food desert is. I want to mention there's a fairly new area of research, excuse me, looking at the effect of the gut biome, your gut bacteria colonies, the world of your gut bacteria, and our psychological functioning and physiological functioning, and certain bacteria associated with impaired mental health, certain gut bacteria. In this example that I'm going to discuss now, enhance cognitive functioning, specifically in children. How do they measure that? Well, feces samples from children, and they compared the children that were functioning problematically cognitively versus functioning well, and certain bacteria, the 4 mentioned in this slide, are associated with enhanced cognitive functioning. The last one, associated with poor, than average cognitive functioning. So we'll learn more about this, and down the road, will we maybe actively alter our gut biomes according to what condition we have? Quite possibly, but we're not there yet. Do you have to know the name of these bacteria? Absolutely not. I just put them there so in case you were curious. But it's an interesting direction, and you can see that it's correlational research, high functioning with certain bacteria, low functioning with certain bacteria. So you might remember what we said about correlational research in terms of should we go and start popping pills with cultures that are perhaps frozen that would just go into our digestive tract. Well, remember what we said about the correlational study before you jump there. So a food desert is a environment in which there are no nearby grocery stores, no farmers markets, and the only food available is fast food and junk food. So it will be high in calories, high in sugar, high in preservatives. They'll have this person will probably have very little fruit or vegetable in their diet, so a very unhealthy diet. And unfortunately, stores are even pulling out of areas due to issues in terms of theft, which is a real big problem nowadays in any supermarket. So the food desert would typically be a city environment in which locally the person has no grocery stores whatsoever, no farmers markets. And the food that's available is fast food, which is high in everything bad, sugar, fat, very few fruits or vegetables in the diet whatsoever, highly processed food, highly preservative use food. And this is what the adults and children, by lack of any other good alternative, live on. And of course, obesity is also a huge problem in such areas, and obese child has a much higher risk of being an obese adult with a greatly shortened lifespan. And so it's a growing problem in the U.S., and certain stores are actually pulling out of areas. So there's a problem with theft in all supermarkets. In some environments, the risk is others, and so even more food deserts are being created. So let's consider food insecurity in America. Now, if you are one of these people facing food insecurity, remember as a student in our college, all you have to have is a college ID. When you're enrolled, you can visit the food pantry 3 times a month. Now, it does have to be over 3 different weeks, but 3 times a month, and you'll walk away with, my understanding, over $200 of food each visit. And they also can provide you resources that are also local for additional food. And for our students, there's often baked goods near there that have been given to us by our in-house bakery or by local bakeries. So if you could use it, please do take advantage of it. So what is food insecurity? This person would have a consistent lack of access to enough food for what they need to be active, to be healthy, due to lack of money. That's a USDA definition. It affects 1 in 5 adults, and in children are actually more likely to be affected than adults. And many middle class people think, it's these parents that nobody's working. 85% of these families have at least one working parent. Who are the highest risk children? Well, living in a single woman-headed household, and Black and Hispanic children, in all cases, have a higher risk as well. Let's consider the effects of childhood stress, and in particular ACEs. The topic of ACEs is very hot right now in psychology and in TT programs and early childhood programs. Take a moment and see if you know or remember what ACEs, that acronym stands for. Well, ACEs stand for adverse, as in bad, adverse childhood experiences. Take a moment and consider maybe children that live in New York State, and then maybe widen your picture to the world, but particularly children in New York State, what sort of events do they experience? What sort of experiences do they experience that would possibly contribute to ACEs? Take a moment and actually maybe write some down in your notes. Well, ACEs definitely would include neglect and abuse, home violence, which does not directly literally hit them, but other family members, or it could be a separation from a parent, such as due to Army service or working other areas, non-Army, or maybe arrest. Having a parent with a severe mental illness could definitely trigger ACEs. If you widen your picture up, it could be immigrants who have traumatic experiences. Virtually every immigrant that's walking across Mexico from other countries and gets to the U.S., virtually all have had traumatic experiences. And not all survive that, by the way, we should know. Or consider right now in Palestine, virtually every Palestinian child has ACEs. And obviously this is not a complete list that you had or that I had. Consider one particular study done by Kaiser Permanente, which is very recognized in CDC, which you probably know is the Center for Disease Control. They determined that traumatic experiences in childhood are actually the root cause, the main cause for many social, cognitive, and emotional impairments in adulthood. For example, self-destructive behaviors such as alcohol, drug abuse, eating disorders, chronic unhealthy relationships where you pick the abusive person over and over. Also, other mental health issues such as anxiety disorders, mood disorders, personality disorders, chronic health issues, disability, and even premature death. So a topic that we're recognizing is essential to know and hopefully start to offer remedies for. Certainly this is a rather grim slide, but important for psychology students, parents, or aunts, uncles, what have you to know. Only the first two causes of death are ranked by commonality. For the first time ever, firearms is more likely to kill a child than motor vehicle accidents. The other major reasons I've listed I didn't rank because they shuffle back and forth from year to year. Regarding firearms, I don't know if you are a parent now or a future parent, but would you, if you sent your child to another house, ask the parent if there are firearms in the house and if they are kept locked up? Unfortunately, a child may know where the key is hid and show their new friend the gun with disastrous results. So this is something to think about, and some of my parents have told me they won't even let their child play at another parent's house. Another point I want to make on the slide is COVID-19. Right now, the immunization rate in our country is about 11%. And this surprises me since I lost people in COVID, and I assume most people did too, and those people would have desperately wanted to have the shot to prevent it, and yet only 11% of people are immunized right now. The people that are being hospitalized and people going on ventilators are virtually all people who opted out of the vaccine. People are often unconcerned with child COVID because children are less likely to get it, and that is absolutely true. But still, currently COVID right now ranks number 8 in death of people that are children. So definitely discuss it with your pediatrician, and probably he, she, or they will strongly urge you to have the child immunized. We should probably also mention poisoning. Most people think of maybe a young child getting into a cleaning product under the sink, which definitely can happen and definitely should be properly locked. But poisoning right now is most likely to be a child getting into mom or dad's or their cousins or the siblings' vaping equipment, because vaping equipment can be toxic, just as well as other recreational drugs that might be lying around the house. So definitely consider them in terms of the safety of your house, whether you have maybe a younger niece or nephew visiting, or if you let your child go to another house to stay overnight, maybe that of your sibling, and they have say teenage or people in their 20s in their house that might be using such things. So be very mindful to avoid tragedy, hopefully. Since we are discussing childhood death by poisoning, I thought I would or should indicate the most likely agent of the accidental child death. And although vaping products are a high concern, the most common single cause of poisoning death in the U.S. is opioids. So bear that in mind. So now let's consider cognitive development. Even though this modules and most of our modules are organized into physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional, do you remember that cognitive has physical slash, of course, biological underpinnings? So even though we treat them as 3 separate areas, there's tremendous overlap. For example, consider in our last module, we'll consider parenting. Is parenting physical care? Is it emotional care? Is it cognitive care? I had to put it somewhere, so I put it under socio-emotional. But you could easily argue it should be placed in physical or cognitive. So again, even though we're looking at 3 different domains of development, do see them as overlapping and interrelated. So let's consider the concept of executive function and relate it to early childhood. Now, I assume in Intro Psych you did the intelligence chapter and maybe learned about Simon Binet, who did the first intelligence test, and perhaps you looked at some of the theorists' view of intelligence, perhaps, for example, Guilford and his areas of intelligence, or Cattell and his fluid and crystal, or maybe Gardner and his basic 7 or 9, and David Sternberg and his triarticle theory. If we go back to a moment, Cattell and his crystallized and fluid intelligence, crystallized are the facts, the bits of knowledge that you have or a child has, that, gorillas eat bananas, so, they probably get very few. Versus fluid is what we're talking about here, the ability to actually think. And to widen it up, executive function includes our ability to initiate an activity, to plan and organize, whether it's organize your room or your notebook or your life, to set goals. You're in college because apparently you have some. To solve problems, to regulate your emotions, so you don't go to tears or rage when any old thing happens. And to monitor your own behavior, say, oh, I shouldn't really be doing that, right? Or I need to do that more if it's in case of healthy eating. So we're going to see notable increase in executive function during early childhood, especially in terms of self-monitoring, to be able to pay attention purposefully and in general thinking, plus all the other actions that we would consider above our beginning or enhancing. So good, high-quality home environments can enhance intellectual growth. So what goes into having a high-quality environment? Activities for the child to do that stimulate mental growth. So this would not be games that are in their hands or the TV set. Often parents use these as a babysitter, but educational toys and books, affection, language stimulation, academic stimulation. So the child will arrive at kindergarten knowing their numbers and most or all of their letters and so on, can identify colors and animals, all right, all those things and more. Also, reasonable demands are put on the child to have them maybe pick up their own toys, pick their plate, if it's something unbreakable, to the sink or dishwasher, to put their own clothes away, so on. Just reasonable demands that would increase as the child is capable. Their use of reason, not punishment. You shouldn't do that because it's dangerous, not don't do that because I told you so. It's the use of reasoning. So all these and more enhance intellectual growth. And later on in the chapter, we'll tie into a particular set of parenting styles which have these sort of demands or don't, or has affection or don't. But we'll see that later on. Let's specifically consider vocabulary development. A 2-year-old, the vocabulary increases from about 200 words to an impressive over 10,000 words at age 6. So I hope you're impressed, but think that 200 to 10,000 in just a couple of years. The child acquires roughly 5 new words per day. How does this happen? Something called fast mapping. It's when a word is tied to an already existing concept. So the concept is there, it's just waiting for a word. So Noam Chomsky might say that our brain is built to quickly learn language, but in any case, 5 new words a day. Let's consider grammar development and overgeneralization. This is seen in children or individuals learning a new language. So a grammar rule is learned and it's overapplied, particularly likely to happen with irregular verbs. So he runned home instead of ran home. Although the parent might consider it to be an error, it's actually reflecting learning of the ed for the past tense. Or the famous experiment that looked at this, they made up word wug. So this is a wug. Now there is another one. There are now 2 of them. There are 2. Trying to see if the child has learned the S's. There are 2 wugs. Perhaps you're learning in college a second language and you complain about the irregular verbs. I remember I can do that. I remember that with our peers in high school learning Spanish. So again, not just limited to children, but really anybody learning a language. So what can parents do to support language development? Well, have frequent conversations. The more the better. When a child speaks incorrectly, recast it. So, oh, you mean he ran. We say he ran. We don't say he runned. We say he ran. So recast it, rephrase it. Also expansions. Elaborate on the child's speech, increasing its complexity. So yes, it's broke. Yes, the car is broken. And just add on. So by expanding and recasting, parents can help to support the language development of their child. And early enhanced language ability is strongly predictive of success in the later school years, including even finishing high school, going to college. So early support reaps a lot of benefits. We talked about the vocabulary gap in an earlier module, so just bear that in mind. Let's now consider egocentric speech, which is also called private speech. You can use those terms interchangeably. It's self-directed, basically directions for oneself. It might be to walk one through the steps of something difficult or to stay calm. It's used for self-guidance. Use of it leads to greater cognitive and emotional control. Beginning around 6 or 7, much of it goes underground and becomes silent, but might come out in times of high stress or when perhaps doing something difficult or you're being emotionally taxed, particularly when no one's around. I know that my office mate and I, when we're trying to organize what we need to do before we run to class, we might be giving ourselves instructions. We'll laugh, realize that we're both doing it aloud. Let's now consider the 3 stages of speech development. Stage 1 is social speech, prior to age 3. So the speech is used to tell others of needs and thoughts. So, for example, if the child exclaims, "Teddy," it might mean, "My teddy fell on the floor, please hand me Teddy." Do you remember when we introduced the concept of one word standing for a whole sentence? Was it telegraphic speech, or perhaps was it a hollow phrase? Hopefully you're thinking hollow phrase. So the child is getting what it needs by social words. Now at stage 2, egocentric speech, the private speech that we were just talking about, directed themselves. So maybe counting aloud as they count their tater tots, because counting is still maybe at the early part of the stage new and difficult. Stage 3, that egocentric speech goes internal, and although the words might be still occurring, they're silently inward. And most people are now thinking in words. Now, I should say that not everybody thinks in words. Often when I discuss language in intro psych, a student may say that they don't think in words. It's more of a pictorial thing. They often have a difficulty explaining, is this the way they experience life? Most people on the spectrum also think in words, but there's an increased likelihood that somebody on the autistic spectrum might actually think in a picture sort of way instead of a sound, thought-based way. It would be impossible, or at the very least highly incorrect, to talk about children's cognition and not talk about Piaget and Piaget stages. So since you presumably had them in intro psych, and at the very least had them in module 1, see if you can remember what Piaget stages are and what order they're in. Actually do it before you peek, please. So hopefully you said sensory motor for the first stage. Then you probably remember something operational. So stage 2, pre-operational. Stage 3, hope you weren't tempted by just the word operational alone. It would be what type of operational. Stage 3 would be concrete operational. And the 4th stage is maybe a mnemonic. Stage 4 is formal operational. So sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operational. So the pre-operational stage is 2 to 6 or 2 to 7, depending on the child. Now we need to introduce, or hopefully from intro psych, review the concept of operation. For Piaget, operation meant logical thinking. So here's a question for you. A child in Piagetian stage 2, in other words, the pre-operational stage, is he, she, or they capable of thinking logically? Don't ride the fence. It's either a yes or no. So think about it and decide yes or no in terms of logical thought. I find this particular question interesting. I've been asking it for over 20 years. Initially, none of my students would get it wrong, or maybe just one or most two people in the class. Recent semesters, oh, maybe a quarter, third, maybe even half the class gets it wrong. Why the change in this ability to answer this? I'm tempted to say greater amount of time spent with the cell phone, less time spent interacting with others and educational materials. But again, correlation doesn't mean causation. So back to the answer, well, what does the word pre mean? Before, right? So literally it's called before the stage of operations, pre-operational, before the stage of operations. So no, they cannot think logically, which makes it a very interesting age to learn about and study. So let's look at some of the major thought limitations that Piaget investigated, and was often the very first to describe. So just as it would be impossible, if not reasonable, to skip Piaget for cognitive development, we similarly have to do Erikson for the socio-emotional development. Now, Erikson, we've covered the previous stage before because it straddles the infancy and toddlerhood age, but it also is for part of our early childhood, since early childhood is age 2, and the autonomy versus shame and doubt also straddles this. So let's just do a quick review. So autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy means they can do for themselves. So they're trying to do new things, whether it's put their own food in their mouth, though it might land more in their face, in their lap, in the table than in their mouth, but trying to do things on their own, versus shame when they do badly or doubt they can do it at all. Stage 2 issues. Stage 2 is initiative versus guilt. They're doing many new things. So, and it's building on the previous stage of autonomy, of course. So they're doing many new things, but may not sure when they should or do, or maybe they're overdoing some things that they should not, things that are dangerous. Guilt over possible bad outcomes, guilt over failure, maybe guilt over not doing something like, why aren't you dressed yet? We're leaving, or what have you. So the goal would be to find a balance between what that child can do and should do versus providing structure so they don't extend themselves too far to do something that's too risky, either psychologically maybe or dangerously. So obviously the parent can't let the child do everything they want at any age, especially this age. So just to maybe stir up memories from previous modules or even courses. So Erikson was a student of whom? And what was his orientation? Psycho something. And clearly he's a stage theorist. So does that mean he has a continuous or a discontinuous viewpoint of development? So see if you can answer those 3 questions before you go on. So hopefully the questions I just posed were moderately easy, or at least hopefully most of them were. So Erikson, definitely one of Freud's inner circle. Unlike Freud, who had a psychosexual orientation, Erikson, whose emphasis was, of course, socio-emotional development, given the fact where we're discussing him, he was a psychosocial theorist. And if you have stages, you see breaks in development, so that's discontinuous. So yes, he had a discontinuous perspective of development. Whereas though Freud emphasized the early stages as being most critical and formative, Erikson, as we'll see as we proceed through adolescence and young adulthood and middle adulthood and late adulthood, we'll see that Erikson has a more lifespan focus. So let's look at some of the pre-operational thought limitations that Piaget investigated. Start with egocentrism. Now, some words in psychology are used very differently than they would be in a casual conversation. If I say, oh, he is so egocentric, oh, she or they is or are so egocentric, this is not how Piaget is using the term. In this Piagetian context, egocentrism means that perhaps initially you're not even aware that others have a different viewpoint than you. But later on, you don't realize that their viewpoint is different than yours. So imagine this little boy is talking to Grandma, and Grandma asks, "Did you get the toy I sent you for your birthday?" And the child maybe gives a great, big, beautiful smile and shakes his head up and down vigorously to Grandma to indicate that yes, he got the toy. Not realizing, well, Grandma is somewhere else, and in a regular phone, she can't see you. So in this example, it's literally in terms of can't see others' viewpoints, but it doesn't have to be a visual example. How would you test in the laboratory? Let's move on to the next slide that shows Piaget's famous test for it. So take a moment to visit the video clip. It takes maybe 45 seconds or a minute total, not a lot of time, and it's interesting. So this famous test of egocentrism is called the three-mountain test. And when you visit the video clip, you'll see how it works. So let's consider class inclusion and a related issue with categories. Let's do the simpler one first, perhaps, the issue with categories. In intro psych, I asked my students to think back when they were young. And did you ever remember a time that you were confused when maybe your mother calls your auntie sister? And it's like, why is mommy calling auntie sister? Auntie is auntie. Or perhaps confusion when your daddy calls grandpa dad. Why is daddy calling grandpa dad? Grandpa is grandpa. Daddy is daddy. So we recognize that you can be in multiple categories. You can be student, worker, perhaps parent, perhaps Republican or Democrat, DEI activist, environmentalist, lover of anime, or what have you. So you can be in multiple categories easily. But for a child that's pre-operational, that can be confusing. So that's a problem with categorization. Now let's extend to a related but still different thing, class inclusion. Now if we show a child the pictures below and say blue flowers and red flowers, if I'd ask you which are there more of, red flowers or flowers overall, you'd say, of course, overall. But for a young child, they will say there are more red flowers than total flowers. Again, that class inclusion idea, that class inclusion confusion. Now, if you ask that to a 6-year-old, they might answer very surely with the wrong answer. Or between 6 and 7, they'll start to get confused because they're shifting away from the pre-operational thinking into adult thinking. Perhaps the most researched of the child pre-operational cognition issues will be a young child's lack of conservation. We are conservers, and we probably can't even imagine not having it, but we all start with an inability to conserve. It's knowing that little changes don't change the nature, the quantity of an object. So click the experiment below. You may or may not have seen it in intro psych in its entirety, but click it again or for the first time and see the different tasks of conservation and see how a young child fails it. And at a certain point, we won't see this, but at a certain point the child will become confused in terms of which is more or less, and then after they've left the pre-operational child a stage, gone into concrete operational, they'll give the answer that you or I would. Now, why do many of these issues occur? Well, as you read your text, you'll learn about issues such as irreversibility, centration, and so on. So in no small part is these issues that you'll learn about on your own. But it's also that, in a broader sense, pre-operational means before logic. So the child isn't being driven by logic like we are. The child is going by appearance, And in many of these changes, yes, one does look more than the other, but logically we know that it hasn't gotten bigger or smaller. So we're driven by logic. Their answers are driven by, in no small part, appearance. The lack of things such as the lack of be able to reverse centration and so on. So animism is giving objects human qualities. So the lost toy is maybe afraid or sad. Now adults do this too, but we really don't mean it. We might say, she's a fast ship, but probably we really don't think the ship has an actual female gender. I would throw in there that different cultures use different genders when they're assigned to words. So for example, in German, the bridge is male. In another language, the bridge is female. So different cultures decide which words are masculine and feminine, and it will actually affect how people think about the particular items. So if you ask a German to describe a bridge, they'll give you things describing its functionality, its strength. In languages such as some of the Hispanic related tongues, the Romanic languages, it'd be a female, so it'd be emphasizing the beauty, for example, the lines and the artistry of the bridge, not its functionality and strength. So language will influence how we conceptualize the world, but back to this example, it's giving animals, not animals necessarily, but it's giving objects human qualities. Artificialism is when the child, the pre-operational child, assumes that things that happen in this world are due to human actions, when they're actually not. So you might say, global warming is due to humans. Well, this is not artificialism. That's actually due to humans. But for example, I can remember my parents telling me that thunder was bowling in the sky. Okay, artificialism. Or leaves are turning color because someone forgot to water the trees and the leaves are dying. So artificialism, again, is given human explanations to the phenomena that happen in the world. And specifically, the ones aren't related to human interaction or behaviors. Let's consider two forms of reasoning which are slightly related. I think you'll find that to be the case when you're learning them, but still different. Okay, transductive. First example, a bird trips, your neighbor falls down. Clearly, the bird's chirping caused your neighbor to fall down. So the child is assuming that if two things happen at the same time, one must cause the other. Obviously not necessarily the case. So hopefully you remember from correlation doesn't mean necessarily causation. Or a different example, shown below, if I put my bathing suit on in the winter, will it become instantly summer? Oh, that were the case. But in any case, that you can cause things to happen which are not related to the possible world. So your behavior can cause profound changes in the world that humans can't produce. Let's review an old concept and tie in a new one, though perhaps you learned in intro psychology, quite possibly. So we earlier learned about the zone of proximal development. And it's pictured on the right. It's what the child can do with help. So that means they can't do it without the help. So how does scaffolding fit into this zone which they need help to achieve? Well, scaffolding is when the parent, the caretaker, the teacher enters that zone and assists them with that task that's beyond their ability. So complementary, one is all the things that they can't do without help, and scaffolding is actually providing that help that's needed. Hope that's clear. I think it's likely that you've heard of Head Start, but might not have specific knowledge, so let's address that. It's a program started by the U.S. DHHS, oh, that's a lot of letters, See if you can guess any of them. I'll give you a moment. Well, I assume you got as far as U.S. Department of something. That's good enough. Health and Human Services. And what is this program? It's vast. It's overarching. Looks at the child's education, but also their health, also their nutrition. There's much more emphasis on nutrition nowadays. Food pantries are common in at least cities. If you're a rural person, that might be very difficult, but we now recognize nutrition as being so key to learning. And also this program looks at parent involvement, so it's not just done for them, they are an active part of it. It's specifically to low-income children and families, so they have to be income qualified. So remember we looked at the vocabulary gap, the huge difference in words between lower SES and middle-class children that can have a lasting effect on education and future income. Well, Head Start began its little history in 1964, and it was part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. So the government threw its focus into helping correct poverty. This is one very successful component of it. To date, over 40 million children and their families have passed through it. So what it is, and just a little bit of a history. So a lot of money has been spent on Head Start, and certain critics say, well, the effects are short-lived. The boosts in reading and math and so on may not be there the next year or the year after. Fair enough, but let's look at the big picture. Children that go through Head Start are more likely to graduate high school. That has a profound effect on their life. They're more likely to go to college, also a profound effect on their life, and most likely their children as well, if they do have children. So in the big picture, it is well worth every dime spent on it. We know that the critics, you can always have critics of anything, but the critics of Head Start criticize it for finding certain things it doesn't alter. But the overall picture is that child more likely to graduate high school? Yes. Are they more likely to go to college? Yes. And that means higher income from them and their families and all the other things that go with it, including obviously health for life. So in terms of political parties, when you vote, consider what's important to you and where your party lies. So let's take a glimpse at types of preschools and kindergartens. If you ever pondered the term kindergarten, sounds German, it is. Kinder means child. Garten in German means garden, so literally a garden for the children, a garden of the children perhaps. So there's two basic alternate models, child-centered versus academic. In child-centered, the child selects activities, so there's many learning activities stations all over the room, and the child will select them, and learning occurs without them even knowing it via play. Academic programs are much more formal. The teacher structures learning environment, gives formal lessons to a group or all the children at the same time, and of all its good features, unfortunately it does decrease motivation and love of learning. Pre-Ks and kindergartens that are substandard not only affect the child during that time that they're there, but can have lasting effects that will carry through them through their educational process and even later in life. So children with poor quality pre-K, they're going to have lower cognitive scores on standardized tests. They're going to have less social skills, and that's often tied to having a greater rate of behavioral problems. Self-control has two major facets. One is response inhibition, stopping yourself from doing something you like to do, whether it's to say something to a particular person, throw a particular driver of the bird, or what have you, not doing it. The other one is to delay your gratification. In other words, wait long term for something. In class, I often ask my students, why are you here today? you're probably going to get nothing from being here today other than maybe a few participation points, but it's the higher grade which might lead to the diploma, which might lead to the acceptance at a major university, which might lead to a desirable job and a desirable whatever. So the ability to wait. A famous test on delay of gratification is well known in psychology, called the marshmallow test, created by Walter Mischel. The child, well, I'll let you click the link, but it's been associated with various major positive outcomes. You'll learn that it's been associated with more likely to go to college and also higher income in life. Again, click the link because I'm leaving all the details of how it's done, which is important and could possibly show up on a future test. We'll have to see. I should mention, because I'm not sure the clip does or does not, the marshmallow test followed these children for 40 years. So definitely a very good example of a famous longitudinal study. Let's consider the development of self-concept in early childhood. A necessary precursor is self-recognition. Click the link. I think you'll find it very interesting. My mentor in graduate school actually developed the test. It was first used long before it was used in children in chimpanzees in the early 1970s. The major difference between the test that you'll see in chimpanzees, they have to be anesthetized prior to the procedure so they can wake up already manipulated. Too dangerous to do this while they're awake. Unlike with a child, you just surreptitiously do what they do. So watch the link. I think you'll find it very interesting. And the researcher, I don't know if I mentioned his name, Gordon Gallup Jr. was the name of this immensely important psychologist of the evolutionary persuasion. So our self-concept is the idea of who we are, and from it springs all sorts of things in terms of what we think we're capable of. But initially, it's fairly rudimentary and develops when we develop. So if you talk to a child that's early in early childhood, their self-concept might be, I own a truck. And if you probe them, my grandmother gave me the truck. And that might be about it for the self-concept. Maybe they would add on, I'm a boy or a girl, perhaps. When I ask my students in intro psych to work on the self-concept, they'll mention all sorts of things, including relationships, future goals, personality traits, physical traits, demographic, belief systems, religions, all sorts of things that spring from this initial self-concept that's often just rooted in the most obvious physical characteristics. I don't know if you can cover self-concept without mentioning Cooley in his very, very famous concept of the looking glass self. It refers to the fact that we decide who we are by incorporating the way other people perceive us. So their judgments, for better or for worse, become often part of our self-concept. Hence, they're providing a looking glass that we can look at ourselves with. So before we tackle the slide, consider those 3 blanks and guess which 3 words might fit best. So hopefully one of the words was think or cognition. Hopefully another word you were thinking about was either feelings or emotions. And hopefully the other word that you're tempted by would be behaviors or maybe actions. So think, act, and feel perhaps. So if I ask you, what's on your mind? I'm asking you about what are you thinking about? And of course, it could also be related to how you're feeling about something, and that can certainly influence your behaviors. So fairly young, the children will realize that the mind can contain falsehoods, things that are actually untrue. So let's consider this clever little research. So a child is shown a Band-Aid box and asked, what do you think is in it? And they will typically say, Band-Aids. You open the box and out spills crayons. Surprising. And then you shut the box. Then you ask the child, either 3 or 5 in this particular study, if I asked you what was in this box before I opened it, what would you have said? 3-year-olds surprisingly would have said crayons, which clearly they couldn't have guessed. A 5-year-old would say Band-Aids. Now, if we ask the child, can you tell me the name of one of your friends? And say they say Ginny or Rebecca or Fatima, whatever. If I asked your friend, what do they think would be in this box? A 3-year-old would say crayons, which obviously that friend would have no way of knowing. The older child would say, of course, as we would, Band-Aids. So the older child realizes that things can be not as they appear, that we can think things that are apparently actually false. 3-year-olds cannot make that distinction. If we would do the same research with autism, a higher number of older children would give the response of the 3-year-old. Some people on the spectrum would have deficits in mind. In other words, understanding the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of others. So we noted in a few slides earlier, self-concept starts simple, begins emerging at 3. This is new information, still very simple at 5. You mentioned earlier, defined by possessions. I own a truck, or in her case, I own a truck, or maybe in his case, I own a doll. Observables like I wear my hair in braids now, or daily behaviors like I go to school. Again, compared to your self-concept, if I would ask you the defining features, you might include all these, but probably none of them would be stressed, such as a child this age stress. The emotions related to self-consciousness appear in early childhood: shame, embarrassment, guilt, pride. I love this picture I attached here. The look on the child's face, clearly this isn't staged. Look at the face. Anyway, this will be our segue slide to socio-emotional development.